Great man of India, Babur, the tiger of the Mughals, 1482 to 1530 AD. Zahiruddin Muhammad, surnamed Babur, the tiger, was born in 1482 AD. He was a Jaktai Turk by race and descended from two of the greatest conquerors on his father's side and Genghis Khan on his mother's. His ancestral home was in Fergana, what is now Russian Turkestan, a pleasant country of vales and mountains, lying between the Oxus and the Sir Darya rivers, abounding in roses, melons, apricots, and pomegranates, and full of game to give sport to the hunter. His father, Sheikh Umar, was a companionable man, inclined, as Babur tells us in his memoirs, to corpulence and apt to burst open his tunic if he moved too hastily after a meal. He was fond of backgammon and could on occasion turn out tolerable verses. He was frank and honest, but had a violent temper. He was very skilful with his fists and never hit a man without knocking him down. His generosity was large, and so was his whole soul. He was of a rare humor, genial, eloquent, and sweet in his discourse, yet brave, vital, and manly. Babur's uncle, the king of Samarkand, was a great soldier and a bit of a dandy. He always wore his turban with the fold tied exactly over the eyebrow, and was so well mannered that on one occasion he sat for hours on a bone rather than uncross his legs in the presence of his preceptor. He had, however, the family failing for strong drink, and on occasion would carouse with his courtiers day and night without a break for 20 or 30 days on end. Babur himself was a true child of his race, handsome, affable, and fearless. He was an expert polo player and a deadly shot with the bow. He would plunge into an ice cold mountain torrent and swim it, and could run along the battlements of Samarkand with a man under each arm, leaping the embrasures as he went. In 1494, Sheikh Umar died. He was inspecting a pigeon cote on the cliff side when it collapsed and fell over the precipice, carrying him with it. Immediately, anarchy broke out in Samarkand, and Babur had to flee. But 3 years later, at the age of 12, he returned, routed his rivals, and restored order. Samarkand was in his hands, however, for only a short time. While he was away on an expedition, his enemies seized the city, and he found himself once more an exile. After wandering about the country for another 3 years, in 1500, he suddenly swooped down again on Samarkand with a handful of followers, 240 in all. Some hardy spirits scaled the wall and threw open the gates. The city was asleep. Only some shopkeepers, peeping out, discovered what had happened and gave thanks to Allah. Soon the news spread, and the citizens, with great joy and congratulations, fraternized with my men. The boy king was seated on the throne under the royal arch in the beautiful home of his fathers, with its orchards and pleasure gardens. The kiosk adorned with pictures of Genghis Khan's exploits, the China house with its blue tiles, college and observatory, and the famous palace of the 40 pillars. But his triumph was destined to be short lived. In the following year, Shahi Beg, the great Khan of the Uzbeks, advanced to expel him. Babur, who was still only a headstrong boy, rashly accepted battle with his more experienced opponent, who turned his flank and drove him in disorder to take shelter behind the walls of the town. Samarkand was besieged, and so close was the blockade that the poor were reduced to eating dogs and donkeys, and the horses browsed on the branches of trees. There was no help for it, and Babur soon found himself once more a wanderer on the face of the earth. But nothing daunted his spirits. On the road, he writes, I had a race with Kambar Ali and Basim Beg. My horse got the lead. As I turned round on my seat to see how far I had left them behind, my saddle turned, the girth being slack, and I fell right on my head. Though I sprang up and remounted, I did not recover the full possession of my senses until the evening. At the time of the evening prayer, they halted and killed a horse, from which they cut some steaks. At nightfall, they came to a village where they were given some fine fat meat, sweet melons, and grapes. And so they passed from the extremity of famine to plenty, and from calamity to peace and ease. In all my life, Babur says, I never enjoyed myself so much. Enjoyment after suffering, abundance after want, come with increased relish and afford more exquisite delight. This was in 1502, and the next 2 years Babur spent roaming about the countryside with a tiny body of followers, mixing freely with the shepherds and peasants, who accorded to him the hospitality always forthcoming in the East. It was the kind of life he loved, and on one occasion, to his delight, he stayed with a village elder whose old mother, aged 111, could remember talking to soldiers who had served in the army of his great grandfather Timur when they raided India in 1398. Perhaps this first put into Babur's head the idea of a similar exploit, for he was already meditating all sorts of wild schemes, including a visit to China. He visited an uncle and joined him in an expedition against an old rival, Beg Ahmad Tambal. It resulted in some bonny fighting On one occasion, he met his foe in single combat. Except for his horse, Tumble was completely in mail. I had on my cuirass and carried my saber and bow and arrows. I drew up to my ear and sent my arrow right at his head, when at the same instant an arrow struck me on the right thigh and pierced me through and through. Tumble rushed in, and with the great Samarkand sword I had given him smote me such a blow on my steel headpiece as to stun me. Though not a link of the cap was hurt, my head was severely bruised. I had neglected to clean my sword, so that it was rusty, and I lost time in drawing it. I was alone, solitary in the midst of foes. It was no time for standing still. So I turned my bridle, receiving another saber stroke on my quiver. On another occasion, when he was fighting a chieftain named Sheikh Bayazid, he suddenly ran into his opponent in a narrow lane. Kuli Kulkildash struck down one foot soldier with his mace and had past another. When he fellow aimed an arrow at Ibrahim Beg, who balked him by shouting, "Hey, hey!" and went on, but the man, being no further off than the porch from the hall, let fly an arrow, which hit me under the arm. I had on a Calmac meal and two of its plates were pierced and shivered by the shot. Then he fled, and I sent an arrow after him which caught a foot soldier, who happened just then to be flying along the rampart, and pinned his cap to the wall, where it stood transfixed. A man on horseback passed close by me. I gave him the point of my sword on the temple. He swerved over as if to fall, but caught the wall, and thus supported, recovered his seat, and escaped. Once, when he was lying exhausted with closed eyes, he heard two men arguing with one another which of them should strangle him. He looked up and said, "That is all very well, but I am curious to see which of you dares to approach me first." His would be assailants promptly changed their minds and decamped. But at length, Babur was forced to acknowledge that Samarkand could not be retaken. With a heavy heart, he turned his face southward. One of his many uncles had been king of Kabul. He had lately died, leaving the state in disorder. Why not carve out a kingdom for himself there? I here entered my 23rd year, he notes, and had begun to use the razor to my face. The followers, who still clave to me, great and small, were more than 200 and less than three. Most of them were on foot, with brogues on their feet, clubs in their hands, and tattered clothes over their shoulders. So poor were we that we had only two tents. My own I gave to my mother, and they pitched for me at every halt a felt tent of cross poles, in which I took up my quarters. As he marched, men began to flock to his standard, and at last the force, moving by night up the high passes of the Hindu Kush, reached the summit and saw beneath them the promised land. A brilliant star was shining overhead. "Surely that cannot be Sohail," cried Babur, and one of his companions answered in an extemporized couplet, "O Sohail, how far dost thou shine, and in what distant sky thou rise? God help to the storm beaten wanderer, shines bright in the light of thine eyes. Kabul was occupied early in October 1504. Babur was enraptured with his new kingdom. There were melons in abundance, and fresh flowers and birds to study. Babur, with the keen interest which he always felt in natural history, tells us that he counted 33 distinct species of tulips. He describes how the local sportsmen lassoed herons and netted shoals of fish by stupefying them, and he knew that birds could be caught in thousands when exhausted by their migration over the Hindu Kush. His favorite spots were the Garden of Fidelity, with its lake bordered by oranges and pomegranates, and the Fountain of Three Friends, where he loved to sit and discourse with his boon companions. When the flowers are in bloom, the yellow mingling with the red, I know no place on earth to compare with it. On the hillside near Kabul, he cut out a cistern which he lined with granite. It was filled with red wine, and on the sides he inscribed the following stanza: Give me but wine and lovely girls. All other joys I freely spurn. Enjoy them, Babur, while you may, for youth once past will never return. Here Babur loved to sit with his group of noble and illustrious drinkers, passing round the wine cup, capping verses, and watching the dancing girls. On the rare occasions when he was not fighting, hunting, playing polo, or laying out parks and gardens to beautify his new capital, in his 23rd year, Babur started to carve out his great career by seizing the kingdom of Kabul. Here he is encamped before the gates of the city. Babur leading his army into battle at Panipat in 1524. He conquered the forces of Ibrahim Lodi, Afghan emperor of Delhi, and became master of all Hindustan. The Afghans were a turbulent and independent race, as fond of war as their descendants are today. It took a hard campaign to bring them to their senses, and many a good man and true drank the wine of martyrdom. They were quelled, but at length he beat them so thoroughly that the leaders prostrated themselves before him, with grass between their teeth, as who should say, I am thine ox. He varied his warlike expeditions by a visit to Herat, the chief center of culture in the Middle East, with its 100 colleges, its poets, musicians, and artists. Here, Babur, with his usual gusto, vastly enjoyed the dinner parties and the cultured society of the jeunesse d'Ori until alarming tidings arrived of a revolt at Kabul. It was midwinter and the passes were covered with snow, but there was no help for it. During this terrible journey, an incident occurred which goes far to explain the devotion with which Babur inspired his followers. The force was lost in a snowdrift and seemed likely to perish. A cave was discovered, but Babur refused to take shelter in it. I felt that for me to be in a warm dwelling and in comfort, while my men were in the midst of snow and drift, for me to be within, enjoying sleep and ease, while my followers were in trouble and distress, would be inconsistent with what I owed them, and a deviation from that society of suffering that was their due. So I remained sitting in the snow and wind in the hole that I had dug out, with snow 4 hands thick on my neck, back, and ears. The next morning, a path was discovered, and all found their way down to safety. The revolt was easily crushed, and in 1512 there appeared to be a chance of retaking Samarkand. But Babur's triumph was short lived. After holding the city for 8 months, he was compelled to evacuate it and return to Kabul. But Babur could never sit still for long, and he was already meditating fresh conquests. If the north was barred to him, why not carve out a fresh empire in the rich valleys of the Indus and the Ganges? From the year 910 AD 1504, when I obtained the principality of Kabul, I had never ceased to think of the conquest of Hindustan, but I had never found a suitable opportunity for undertaking it, hindered as I was sometimes by the apprehension of my begs, sometimes by disagreements between my brothers and myself. Finally, all these obstacles were happily removed. Great and small beys and captains, no one dared to say a word against the project. So in 1519, I left at the head of my army and made a start by taking Bajor. From this time to 1525 to 6, I was always actively concerned in the affairs of Hindustan. I went there in person at the head of an army 5 times in the course of 7 or 8 years. The fifth time by the munificence and the liberality of Allah. There fell beneath my blows an enemy as formidable as Sultan Ibrahim, and I gained the vast empire of Hind, as it was always in my heart to possess Hindustan, and as these several countries had once been held by the Turks, I pictured them as my own, and was resolved to get them into my own hands, whether peacefully or by force. For these reasons, it being imperative to treat the hillmen well, this order was given: do not hurt or harm to the flocks and herds of these people, nor even to their cotton ends and broken needles. On Friday, November 17, 1525, when the sun was in Sagittarius, Babur finally set out for Hindustan. His whole force only numbered 12,000, including camp followers, but he had been promised the help of Daulat Khan, the governor of Lahore, who was in rebellion against Ibrahim Lodi. Sultan of Delhi, when he reached the Punjab, the faithless Daulat Khan changed his mind but was easily defeated. Babur then, to quote his own words, placed his foot in the stirrup of resolution and his hand on the reins of confidence in Allah, and marched against Sultan Ibrahim, the son of Sultan Iskandar, the son of Sultan Behlul Lodi Afghan, in whose possession the throne of Delhi and the dominions of Hindustan at that time were. Whose army in the field was said to mount to 100,000 men, and who, including those of his amirs, had nearly 1,000 elephants. The two armies met on April 21, 1524, at Panipat. The historic battleground in the gap between the mountains and the desert, where the fate of India has been so often decided. Babur's force was only a tenth that of his enemies, but while at Kabul, he had acquired a number of firearms, a weapon hitherto almost unknown in the East. These consisted of cannon, civil guns, and matchlocks. Under the command of a master gunner named Ustad Ali Kuli, the traditional Mongol maneuver was to lagger the wagons, and while the enemy was assaulting them, to counter-attack simultaneously on both flanks with swift masses of cavalry. Babur adopted these tactics, resisting his right flank on the walled town of Panipat. He made a lagger of wagons in front with guns at regular intervals, while his left was protected by an abattis of logs. His opponent, a rash and unskillful young man, was tempted into making a frontal attack, hoping by means of his elephants to crush down the rough defenses in front of him. This was just as Babur desired. Withholding his fire until the elephants were at point blank range, he suddenly opened on them with all his guns. The poor brutes stampeded and spread confusion in their own ranks. Whereupon the Mongol cavalry sallied forth and took the enemy in flank, pouring in volleys of arrows from horseback and then charging home. By midday, the battle was over. Sultan Ibrahim and 20,000 men lay dead on the field. The spoils were immense: gold and silver, cloth and jewels, and slaves were heaped upon the officers of the victorious force, and every soul in Kabul received a silver piece. To the share of Babur's son, the young prince Humayun, fell the fairest prize of all, the great Kohinoor diamond. Once reputed to have belonged to the Pandava princes and said to be the most wonderful jewel in the world. Before the enemy could recover, the invaders were knocking at the gates of Delhi. The capital surrendered, and Babur's name was read from the pulpit of the great mosque in the Friday prayers as Emperor of Hindustan. It was now the height of the hot weather, and the climate was well nigh unendurable to men born and bred in the hills. Their idea was to descend into the plains to gather plunder, and then to return to their mountain homes. To settle in this strange and unpossessing country was more than they bargained for. But Babur won them over in a statesmanlike speech. I told them that empire and conquest could not be acquired without the materials and means of war. The royalty and nobility could not exist without subjects and independent provinces. That by the labor of many years, after undergoing great hardships, measuring many a toilsome journey, and raising various armies, and after exposing myself and my troops to circumstances of great danger, to battle and bloodshed, by the divine favor I had routed my formidable enemy and achieved the conquest of the numerous provinces and kingdoms which we at present held. What force compels, and what hardship obliges us, without any visible cause, after having sworn out our life in accomplishing the desired achievement, to abandon and fly from our conquests, and to retreat back to Kabul with every symptom of disappointment and discomfiture. Let not anyone who calls himself my friend ever henceforward make such a proposal. But if there is any among you who cannot bring himself to stay or to give up his purpose of returning back, let him depart. Having made them this fair and reasonable proposal, the discontented were of necessity compelled, however unwillingly, to renounce their seditious purposes. As a matter of fact, he had himself a very poor opinion of India and its inhabitants, and his remarks on the subject are couched in his usual shrewd and penetrating manner. Hindustan is a country that has few pleasures to recommend it. The people are not handsome, They have no idea of the charms of friendly society and frankly mixing together, or familiar intercourse. They have no genius, no comprehension of mind, no politeness of manner, no kindness or fellows feeling, no ingenuity or mechanical invention in planning of executing their handicraft works, no skill or knowledge in design or architecture. They have no horses, no good flesh, no grapes or muskmelons, no good fruits, no ice or cold water, no good food or bread in their bazaars, no baths or colleges, no candles, no torches, not a candlestick. Beside their rivers and standing waters, they have some running water in their ravines and hollows, but they have no aqueducts or canals in their gardens or palaces. In their buildings, they study neither elegance nor climate, appearance nor regularity. The chief excellency of Hindustan is that it is a large country and has abundance of gold and silver. The climate during the rains is very pleasant. On some days, it rains 10, 15, and even 20 times. During the rainy season, inundations come pouring down all at once and form rivers, even in places where at other times there is no water. While the rains continue on the ground, the air is singularly delightful, in so much that nothing can surpass its soft and agreeable temperature. Its defect is that the air is rather moist and damp. During the rainy season, you cannot shoot even with the bow of our country, and it becomes quite useless. Nor is it the bow alone that becomes useless. Coats of mail, books, clothes, and furniture all feel the bad effects of the moisture. Their houses too suffer from not being substantially built. There is pleasant enough weather in the winter and summer, as well in the rainy season. But then the north wind always blows, and there is an excessive quantity of earth and dust flying about. When the rains are at hand, this wind blows 5 or 6 times with excessive violence, and such a quantity of dust flies about that you cannot see one another. A convenience of Hindustan is that the workmen of every profession and trade are innumerable and without end. For any work or any employment, there is always a set ready, to whom the same employment and trade have descended from father to son for ages. Babur at once set to work to make life more tolerable by planting gardens with his favorite flowers and fruits, and by employing Hindu builders to erect palaces after the manner of those in his native country. But an even greater danger loomed ahead. He had found it a comparatively easy matter to deal with his Afghan religionists. But now he heard that the Rajput clans had been called together by the Rana Sangram Singh, the son of Mewar, to drive the infidel intruders from the sacred soil of India. The Rajput army 80,000 horse and 500 elephants, commanded by 120 chieftains of ancient lineage, were the flower of Hindu chivalry. The Rana himself had beaten the Afghans in 18 pitched battles. He was a mere fragment of a man who had lost an arm and an eye in the field. Babur advanced from Agra to a place called Kanua to await the approach of his opponents. He adopted the Mongol tactics, which had proved so successful against Ibrahim Lodi. His wagons were bound together with iron chains, with a cannon at intervals, and in addition, he had mounted mixed match blocks on wheeled tripods which could be moved quickly to any threatened spot. Point. His flanks were protected by deep ditches and entanglements. Babur's men became nervous as the mighty Rajput host approached, but their leader never lost heart. Ever since he became king of Kabul, he had taken to the habit of drinking heavily, in defiance of the precepts of Islam. Now he took a vow that if Allah gave him victory, he would never touch strong drink again. All his beautiful drinking cups were collected and broken to pieces in front of the army, and the wine split on the ground. Then he addressed his men: Noble men and soldiers, every man that comes into the world is subject to dissolution. When we are passed away and gone, Allah only survives, unchangeable. Whoever comes to the feast of life must, before it is over, drink from the cup of death. He who arrives at the inn of mortality must one day inevitably take his departure from that house of sorrow, the world. How much better is it to die with honor than to live with infamy? The Most High God has been propitious to us and has now placed us in such a crisis that if we fall in the field, we die the death of martyrs. If we survive, we rise victorious, the avengers of the cause of Allah. Let us then, with one accord, swear on Allah's holy word that none of us will even think of turning his face from this warfare, nor desert from the battle and slaughter that ensues, till his soul is separated from his body. The army, inspired by these noble words, swore an oath on the Quran to conquer or die. On March 16, 1527, scouts brought word that the enemy were approaching. Babur immediately drew up his men in three bodies with a strong reserve and galloped down the line with words of advice and encouragement. The attack began soon after. Wave after wave of Rajputs threw themselves upon the line, and Babur's artillery did terrible execution. When the enemy had exhausted himself in these fruitless charges, Babur ordered a simultaneous advance in the center and on either flank. At length, the gallant Rajputs began to yield ground and were pursued relentlessly to their camp. Losing enormous numbers of men, a ghastly minaret of heads was erected on the battlefield, and Babur took the title of Ghazi or victor in a holy war. There was still much work to be done, but in the following year, the great stronghold of Chanderi was captured, thanks chiefly to Ustad Ali's heavy artillery. and Babur then undertook expeditions for the purpose of overthrowing the independent Afghan kingdoms in Bihar and Bengal. By the end of the year, he was master of Hindustan, and the foundations of the Mughal Empire were well and truly laid. He did not, however, live long to enjoy his triumph. His few remaining months of life were spent in organizing his new kingdom. The more settled lands were given as jagirs or fiefs to his officers, who paid a fixed sum to the crown, which they recovered by means of land taxes levied on the peasants, duties on merchandise, and the jizya or poll tax on non Muslims. Babur, like all the Mughals, loved gardens. Here he is seen receiving a deputation in the gardens he laid out himself at Agra. In outlying districts, the zamindars or landowners, Hindu and Muslim, were left undisturbed. Hindu masons and gardeners were hard at work beautifying his new capital at Agra, where in December 1529 he gave a grand darbar attended by ambassadors from Persia, Herat, and Bengal. There were fights between elephants and camels and rams, wrestling matches, and jugglers and dances by nautch girls. But Babur was happiest with his family, his beloved son Humayun, and his three daughters, Rosy Face, Rosy Blush, and Rose Body. In December 1530, Humayun was taken ill with fever and lay at the point of death. Babur was distracted and determined to lay down his life for him if he could. The wise men begged him to sacrifice anything, his riches, or even the greatest Kohinoor diamond. Is there any stone, he answered, that can be weighed against my son? Walking thrice round the sick bed, he prayed, on me be the sickness. Then suddenly he cried joyfully, I have prevailed, I have taken it. And from that moment, Humayun gradually recovered. But Babur sickened and died. He passed away on December 16, 1530. One of his last acts was to call the nobles together and put their hands in Humayun's in token of investiture. He was indeed a very perfect, gentle knight, dauntless in adversity, merciful in the hour of victory, a lover of beauty and a loyal friend. He sleeps in a garden on the hillside in Kabul. By the flowers and the running stream, where he once delighted to sit and gaze on the beautiful world. His permanent place in history, says Professor Lane, rests upon his Indian conquests. He laid the first stone of the splendid fabric which his grandson Akbar achieved. But his place in biography and literature is determined rather by his daring adventures and the delightful memoirs in which he related them. Soldier of fortune as he was, Babur was not the less a man of fine literary taste and fastidious critical perception. In Persian, the language of culture, the Latin of Central Asia, he was an accomplished poet, and in his native Turkey, he was master of a pure and unaffected style, alike in prose and verse. As his cousin himself, an excellent historian, writes, no one of his family before him ever possessed such talents, nor did any of his race perform such amazing exploits or experience such strange adventures.